Jesus looking at Israel and then saying, I loved you so much that I married you, that you became my wife, my bride. So this is not the bride of Christ, but this is what people say is the bride of Christ. Now what's interesting is Christ hadn't even showed up yet. So how could this be the bride of Christ if Christ hasn't shown up yet? See how that doesn't seem to work? This is God the Father dealing with Israel. This is when Jesus comes to deal with man. So it's still an Old Testament thing. But they say, well, that's the bride of Christ. Okay, let's continue here in Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 28. I want to read verse 28 down to verse 32. So Ezekiel 16:28, thou hast played the whore also with the Assyrians, because thou wast unsatiable. Yea, thou hast played the harlot with them, and yet couldst not be satisfied. So God is still dealing with Israel, still talking to them as though they were His bride in the marriage relationship. And He says, what you've done is you've gone a-whoring after other people, instead of being my bride and being faithful to me. Verse 29, thou hast moreover multiplied thy fornication in the land of Canaan unto Chaldea, and yet thou wast not satisfied herewith. How weak is thine heart, saith the Lord God, seeing thou doest all these things, the work of an imperious, whorish woman. In that thou buildest thine intimate place in the head of every way, and makest thine high place in every street, and hast not been as an harlot, in that thou scornest higher. He's saying, look, you're not even as bad as a prostitute, because you're not even asking for money when you go a-whoring and committing adultery and fornication. You just do it for fun. God is condemning Israel, saying, look, you're supposed to be faithful to me. I am your God. And look how you're so unfaithful. Just like an unfaithful, adulterous woman. Verse 32. But as a wife that committeth adultery, which taketh strangers instead of her husband. So the Old Testament, God is speaking to Israel. He says they're like a wife. So God says He said, remember we read it, God said, I am married to thee. We read that earlier. So God the Father says to Israel that He is married to them. He calls Israel His wife. She's like His bride. But how could we call that the bride of Christ if Christ hasn't appeared yet? Jesus shows up as the Christ. So this is still as an Old Testament, and is dealing with the nation of Israel. Now let me show you the other passage that many like to go to. But many try to say, well, because they're called the wife in the Old Testament, then that means that Israel is still the wife in the New Testament. Is that so? Well, let's find out. We'll look at that. But let's go to Hosea chapter 2. Now, the book of Hosea is an interesting book. Hosea was a prophet. And Hosea was a prophet, and God told Hosea, you see that woman out there? Go marry her. Oh, and by the way, she's a whore. She's a prostitute. Go marry that prostitute. And God told a man to go marry a whore and a prostitute. And the reason God did so is because God knew what was going to happen. He knew that she would turn away from Him and go back to her business, if you will, go back to her sin. And what God was trying to show Hosea was, you see how bad that feels? See how it hurts to marry someone and then they go commit adultery on you? Hey, that's how I feel, God says. Hosea, that's how I feel. I married Israel. I love them. They were supposed to be faithful to me as their God. And now they're going and committing adultery with other gods and other nations. So God is looking at His relationship to Israel as though it was the relationship of a man and his wife. And God calls Israel an adulterous woman.